Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I'm your host, Anil Padmanabhan. There was a time when global trade was defined by a simple mantra: find the cheapest product, locate the fastest route. In fact, in the heydays of globalization, the world economy was considered flat. That is, till geopolitics crashed the party. Now, nations first ask the question, can we trust before they trade? Fact, things will no longer be the same. What then will be the new geometry of global trade? How will India navigate this new trade order? And is it thinking of coming up with a new playbook to deal with these momentous changes? To decode all of this, we have with us today Harsh Pant. He's a professor at King's College London and one of the sharpest minds on the intersection of geopolitics and geoeconomics. And of course, a previous guest on the show. Welcome back, Harsh.
Thanks for having me, Anil.
Harsh, I wanted to begin with the in the aftermath of President Trump's actions, the momentous shift in the global trade order that we are witnessing seems to be accelerating. In fact, in the new trade order, it is not geoeconomics but geopolitics defining the terms and norms. What are your first thoughts?
Anil, I think in some ways geopolitics has always been there. But I think since 1990s, if you look at the trajectory of the global economy, global economic order, and the assumption was that somehow geopolitics will be have been put in the background, has been put in the background, and geo primarily economic considerations would drive, as you were defining earlier, the calculus of economic cooperation, and ultimately it was even more ambitious. It was the argument was that somehow economics driving politics would also mean changing politics. It would also mean that interstate relations could be managed without taking power calculus into account. That somehow we have transcended the logic of power politics. In fact, you had geographies like Europe openly proclaiming that they want to no longer do balance of power politics. They wanted to put geopolitics on the background. So there was a sense of optimism about the forces of economics driving politics and perhaps changing politics irrevocably. And I think that argument is now facing a moment of crisis, and a crisis of credibility, because certainly what we are witnessing today is that not only geopolitics is back, but as you were saying, some of the assumptions that have been underpinning our understanding of global politics are also being turned on its head. This whole argument about let's trade and become friends to let's trade among friends only, and is becoming the norm of our times. And it will be interesting to see where this goes. But at the moment it seems to be the mantra that every country seems to be abiding by, and therefore whether it's trade, technology, supply chains, everything is being seen through a geopolitical lens, and everything is being measured through that lens as well. So I think we are in for some interesting times from an analytical point of view. But I do think for policymakers who have relied on a certain set of assumptions, those assumptions are constantly evolving and rapidly changing.
Interesting. So, Harsh, what you're saying is that there was never any decoupling between geopolitics and geoeconomics. It's just that the emphasis on geopolitics was minimal. Now that has changed, right? So, which means in this new world order, there's a greater emphasis on de risking because geopolitics is the more dominant force. Uh, and the IMF has already warned that this will cost global trade. In fact, McKinsey just came out with a report about a month ago, which put a number on this, and they said this could cost world trade about $1 trillion. My question is that while it will impact everyone, I presume the opportunity cost is going to be most felt by aspiring economies like India, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, etc., right?
Absolutely. You know that this is, I think, for a country, for an emerging economy like India, a very challenging situation. Because if you recall the whole, and we were discussing 1990s earlier, that was the time when China was growing, China was rising, and that was the time when when we had all of these very positive sounding arguments being made about the logic of economics transcending politics, which meant that it gives space to a country like China to continue to grow without facing the burdens of political constraints that now emerging economies will have to face. So there is a real challenge here that look, you had an economic behemoth like China rising through some of the most stable political climate. And now you have countries like India and the others that you have mentioned, including Vietnam, Indonesia, etc., trying to find their way through a very complex geopolitical mapping of the world, where at this particular point in time it's unclear what support system would be available to them to ensure continued economic growth, because the main guarantors of the global economic order in the 1990s, who had actually established these parameters, who had pushed through this almost ideological predisposition about free trade and free market capitalism, are n- are now challenging those assumptions. So it's not as if the rest of the world is asking some of these tough questions. It is that you had the Americas of the world and Europes of the world saying that, look, there is a fundamental reality check here. We can't go on like we have gone on since 1990s. We need to take a step back. We need to become more inward looking. We need to question these assumptions, and we need to ensure that America first or Europe first policies become the fundamental prism through which they uh, they would view global economy and global politics. So I think in that, if you think of that matrix, you do see a very challenging environment for emerging economies who need markets, who need investments, who need capital, who need finance. How do you get it when the guarantors of those constituencies are no longer interested and have a very different equation now to look at it? Now, one way of looking at it, Anil, would be that to say that, look, if you make an interesting strategic proposition, which is that, look, China is a problem and we are willing to help you with the China problem, then you perhaps become a part of this calculus, right? So a lot of the logic of India-US relationship flows through the Indo-Pacific logic, strategic logic, and therefore economic dynamism of India is in the larger interest of the US. But you can see the challenge that that argument comes through when you are living in the age of Trump, where transactionalism and day-to-day transactionalism becomes the driver. So there is an argument you can make even then, but I think the Trumpian logic is also coming hard and fast, and also pushing us, pushing us to think in ways that perhaps we are not accustomed to.
Harshit, I want to also throw in an additional challenge here, which is China itself. Today, they account for about 30% of global manufacturing capabilities, and their networks penetrate every production line in the world, including green minerals, which India needs to produce electric vehicles and all that. So, how does a country like India or Indonesia or Vietnam negotiate this challenge plus this global rivalry between the West led by United States and China, Russia on the other side?
See, that's, I think the whole story starts from China itself, right? China became too big, China became too centralized a power, and China became almost an impediment to the larger reality of the kind of global economic environment that we had all fantasized about. Uh, and in that sense, when when the reality hit the world that over dependence on China, over reliance on China is not really healthy, and is in the way China was weaponizing this interdependence led to the world questioning the whole logic of China being this one big fat economic giant. Then I think you start evaluating those assumptions. And to his credit, in his first term, Trump did exactly that. He was the first one to argue much more cohesively, cogently than other actors that China threat needs to be tackled. It needs to be tackled in various aspects. It needs to be looked at internally, but it also needs to be looked at globally, because the over reliance on China is not only hurting big economies, but it is also leading to kind of a global economic order that is imbalanced. So he deserves credit for changing the discourse, changing Western policy responses. You can imagine if Trump 1.0 had not happened, I think it would have taken us another few years to come to that the same conclusion. Biden administration continued with most of those policies of Trump. In fact, accelerated many of those policies, and started, providing a certain frame to how the world might deal with this idea of de-risking, to a certain extent. Decoupling, of course, it was clear it would be very difficult and very long term, but de-risking certainly became the norm, and Europe started following that path. Many countries in the Indo-Pacific started working through that prism as well. So China problem is at the heart of this issue. China is actually the main driver why we are talking about many of these things. And as you pointed, as you pointed it out in your question, this the the oversized role that China plays today in so many sectors means that we will not be able to easily answer that particular question, because at the end of the day, we will have to engage with China in some way or the other and find a modus vivendi with the Chinese. Particularly, I think, and that's where things become more complicated, when you have someone like Mr. Trump in office. In Trump 2.0, in this avatar, he's much more unpredictable than he was in his last avatar. Last time he was giving us some sense of coherence. This time he's all over the place, which means that even the strategic logic that you used last time, to engage him, to give him a sense of purpose in particularly say in India relationship, that is missing. So and there are so many other issues this time around. You can bring in Pakistan equation, you can bring in the final trade agreement that you have to reach with Trump. So there are so many issues on the table at the moment that it seems that unless there is some degree of certainty, which was what Mr. Modi was trying to do when he visited Mr. Trump early on in his tenure, unless there is some predictability in his behavior, it becomes very difficult to have even a short-term calibrated response to this challenge. So while the story starts with China, and China is is central to this narrative, I think the problem for many countries like India is arising because suddenly in his second avatar, Trump has become much less predictable than he was in his last one, and therefore navigating those issues through this great power competition will be a real challenge. As you would have heard, the Indonesians have finalized the deal with the Trump, but they have said it was a hell of a ride in concluding that agreement. And I think Indians must be going through the same at this point.
So, will you then, in the case of India and China, recommend India adopt a more transactional approach, which is something new to the way they approach global engagements? And you had said a little earlier that India will have to rethink its position. Does this include a more transactional approach to China rather than looking at it through the lens of pure geopolitics?
I think some degree of transactionalism, Anil, will have to be there. But I think we should also be very cognizant that uh, certain red lines will have to be preserved, because we have seen repeatedly that with China, if you don't have those red lines, Chinese, they have this tendency of pushing you in ways that often you find yourselves unprepared for. So I think those red lines will have to be clearly laid out, because even though I think most countries in the world today, we have seen Australian Prime Minister visiting China recently. We have had a recalibration happening across the Indo-Pacific. Again, against the backdrop of a very unpredictable Trump administration. I think India is already, moving in that direction. We have had an acceptance in last October of by China of the fact that something did go wrong, and therefore in Galwan, and therefore China has also recalibrated a bit under the you know uh, big against the backdrop of Trump. But I think without having red lines, hoping that a degree of transactionalism, while it would be helpful in the short term, it would once again create the same problems for you in the medium to long term that you have been trying to avoid. So our policies, by and large, since Galwan, have been very sensible. They have been that, look, we will stick to some red lines. We will ensure that unless China is talks seriously about border and it restores status quo ante along the border, we will not move forward. Now that Chinese have restored in some ways the status quo ante along the border of pre 2020, I think it makes sense to have an open conversation about what are the possibilities of economic cooperation. We will always find that possibilities of economic cooperation, we will have to find ways of nurturing them to an extent that helps us, but without wearing any rose tinted glasses that it will have an impact on the larger geopolitical relationship with China. It will not. We have seen that even now as we speak, for example, we know what is happening in SCO. We know how the Chinese and the Pakistanis got together, and Indian defense minister had to refuse to sign the joint statement at the SCO. So we know that Chinese will use all the pressure points they have, because that's how they do politics. They do foreign policy. They bring all the levers together and they apply them together. So India will have to learn to do that as well, that whatever levers we have, we will have to bring them together into a cohesive policy response, so as to get the best possible deal on the economic front. Because clearly for India, if your primary requirement is a peace, sorry, development, is your primary goal, a national objective. India wants to become a developed country by 2047 or thereabouts. Then the whole focus has to be to avoid friction and to avoid conflict, and to ensure that wherever there are convergences, to leverage that. That does not mean that the Chinese will give us that space, but we have to create that space for ourselves.
So basically, sup with the devil, but on your own terms. Harsh, I wanted to draw your attention to another fallout of this momentous shift in the global trade order is the discovery of new trade routes. Partly, geopolitics is also accelerating this trend. The best example is IMEC, which is turned out to be a stillborn so far, but all the other countries have not given up hope. You have other trade routes too. So, how do you view this development? Because when you discover new trade routes, you also inspire new trade relations, new geopolitics. So, it's another round of change in the global order.
Yes, sir. I think very significant one, and again, we have to give credit to the Chinese in some ways to start this, this rethinking or reimagination of global trading routes. Because if you think of BRI as the first phase of this development, Chinese were the first to put their money and say that, look, without infrastructure connectivity, we are not going to have the next phase of globalization. So while they messed up a lot of that because of their over centralization, lack of transparency, etc., I think in BRI 2.0, they managed to address some of those concerns, but in the process, they also pushed other actors, to think, to reimagine the trading realities of our times. And I think IMEC, as you say, is a good example where it's a multi-stakeholder project. Again, it's very different from BRI. It's not one country led. It is multimodal, and and it brings in countries from Europe and India via connects India and Europe via the Middle East. And I think the primary stakeholder in this is the Middle East, which is very interesting. That you have middle powers in some ways shaping the emergence of this trading corridor. And as you say, despite the geopolitical challenges since 2023 when it was announced, we have not seen major stakeholders giving up on it, which is very interesting, because which means that when you look at UAE or Saudi Arabia, the two nations in the region in the Middle East invested in this, they continue to work on it at their level. So ultimately, Europe and India, are the two bookends of this. But the large portion of this is to be done at the level of the Middle East, and I think both at that level, it is the continued investment, the continued political engagement with it is quite heartening, given the realities of the Middle East at the moment. So while we have not seen great progress, the fact that no one has come out and said this is a hopeless case, and in fact, whoever has spoken, they have spoken positively about it with of underlining the potential, means that certainly there is something in it which the countries are not willing to give up on, and the fact that it will inspire or it is inspiring a rethinking about how Eurasia is connected, how Europe is connected to India via Middle East, is, I think, going to be an important benchmark, both in terms of the geoeconomics of the region and beyond, but also in terms of what geopolitical implications it carries forward. So I do think that that the way new structures are coming up, the way new trading corridors are being thought about, is also a reflection of our times, that uh, global economic order is rebalancing, because you have new centers of power that are coming up, and those centers of power are now demanding that they be linked to certain other geographies, which perhaps in the past either was not feasible or was not politically palatable. But today that is changing, and I think that change is good. The more conversations, the more thinking, the more operationalization of different kinds of corridors that come up also would allow a certain momentum in global economies to set forth, because what exists today, we know that it is the global economy is not really where it should be, and the challenges in global economic order are only going to rise with the challenges that that we are seeing coming in, particularly from the developed world. So I think it is for the developing world, for the global south, for a lot of the countries that have been on the margins of globalization, to actually start making a case for the next phase of globalization. And I think through these new corridors, we see that happening.
But in the case of IMEC, the India Middle East corridor, you made a very great point that there are lots of more stakeholders in this. Is it also due to the fact that the Middle East or West Asia is the energy hub of the world? And again, like you said, even in Europe and in India, they're all middle income, middle powers, as it were. So it's more like an alliance among equals. Does that also, you know, meaning invest in this kind of a corridor like the IMEC?
Absolutely. And I think, see, energy, if you look at the energy flows today, most of I mean, if you look at, the Middle East, West Asia as the center of the energy dynamic in the world. But if you look at the flows of energy, they are from Middle East to the Indo-Pacific. They are no longer Middle East to West anymore, the primary driver. So that itself is a significant shift, that now Middle East has to acknowledge that it has to deal not with the West as the primary customer, but with the Indo-Pacific powers as the primary customer, and therefore will have to do certain things that they have not done in the past. One of the things is, again, de-risking, right? So in the Indo-Pacific, uh, you cannot simply say that China is going to be the largest buyer, therefore we are going to serve China, because it's a largely in the energy domain. It is becoming multipolar. India is emerging as a big source of resource. So in that sense, India's role is critical, and therefore what we have witnessed in the last decade, this dramatic transformation in India Middle East ties, Saudi Arabia, UAE, if you look at their relationship with India, which is largely today based on geo-economic realities, but that geo-economic realities that is producing some very, very significant geopolitical shifts, which is being embodied in some of these projects. And I think, therefore, the viability of a project like IMEC, uh, one can be more optimistic about than the usual geopolitical realities, would force us to acknowledge. So I do think that this new shape of the global economic order is pushing certain geographies like the Middle East and Indo-Pacific together in ways that were very difficult to comprehend in the past. And Europe, for its own sake, wants to be involved with this dynamic because Europe doesn't want to be left out. So you are looking at a new reality that used to be very different in the past, where you would have seen Europe and the West pushing and the other countries latching on to it. It's the other way around now. And perhaps that gives it greater longevity.
Harsha, I just want to focus very briefly on India. India's ability to be part of this emerging conversation depends to a large degree on how it tackles its own domestic, handicaps, especially in its lack of competitiveness and logistic challenges, some of which are legacy, but some are newly acquired. So, do you see this is also a reality check on India's abilities, and it has to fast track these hard nosed reforms if it needs to really get a foot in the door in this conversation?
Absolutely essential, I think, because we keep on saying that this is India's moment. But if it is India's moment, then India has to do much more than what we have done so far. Because moments are exactly that. They are moments. They don't last very long. So I think if you have to capture the essence of this time, India has to start unraveling those reforms that I think are needed, uh, as you mentioned, in terms of increasing our attractiveness, our attraction for the rest of the world, because that's what uh, will allow us to tap into this latent potential that is there. And I think in some ways, whatever we have been discussing over the last few minutes, that the world is really keen on India because of all the geopolitical and geoeconomic problems that we face. See, at the end of the day, Mr. Trump, for all the problems that he's creating, he will only be there for 4 years. So, in a sense, the strategic logic of India-US partnership is not going anywhere. The strategic challenge of China is not going anywhere. The great power contestation is not going anywhere. So, India's attraction to the rest of the world, as as part of the larger China plus one strategy, or India's attraction as the fastest growing major economy in the world at the moment, will be there with us for a while. And which means that if you have to then scale up from there, it is for India to decide what else it can do at this point. How can it unleash those reforms that are difficult at times, but they are necessary? Because if we don't do it now, then when? And that, I think, is essentially the question that India and Indians have to ask. And I think the world is quite responsive at this point in time. Some of the issues, we are already seeing some, being tackled, like India's reservations on FTAs, etc., that are being managed better, because in the past we were not seen as very reliable economic interlocutors. I think now we are seeing a greater acceptance that India will have to be dealt with on its own terms. But India is also indicating that it is willing to integrate more, not via big multilateral, treaty arrangements, but by bilateral FTAs, which are, seemingly at this point the flavor of the season. So India is doing a bit, but I think it will have to do much more than if you have to really scale up the present momentum in the India's economic growth story.
Harsh, we'll have to sign off on that note, but it's a great note to sign off on the new boldness in India's approach to this new trade order. Thank you for speaking to us.
Thank you, Anil.
So, I just want to wrap up this conversation by renewing my argument that there is a new geometry of the global trade order that is taking shape. And given all that Harsh said, particularly the headwinds facing aspiring economies like India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Middle East, and so on, it's not going to be easy. A lot depends on how countries approach this challenge. In India's instance, it has to challenge its own imagination. Can it believe in itself to undertake hard nosed economic reforms, to expand their voice at the global high table, and become a pole in this new global trade order rather than just being a cog? Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to StratNewsGlobal.Tech on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your thoughts, ideas, and suggestions with us. I'm available on X at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.